Thank you for inviting me. Thank you, Gresham College, for inviting me, and in particular for making up a panel that otherwise consists of three Lords of Epping. I called my talk Shipman Inquiry, Was It Worth It? Because I was being pressed to think of a title, and I hadn't really thought at that time about what I was going to say. But in the end, it has turned out to be a fairly appropriate title for the things that I do want to talk about. The short answer to the question I posed will be rather dusty. It'll be in a way yes and in a way no. Let me just remind you briefly about what the Shipman Inquiry was about. Harold Shipman was a general practitioner in Hyde, near Manchester. In August 1998, he was arrested on suspicion of the murder of one of his patients. After a police investigation, he was charged, tried and convicted of the murder of 15 of his patients, although the police suspected that he had killed rather more. After the trial, an inquiry was set up. Lord Laney has just told you about it and its fate. It was turned out that terms of reference made it a private inquiry, and the families wanted a public inquiry, and they got it by judicial review. I was appointed as chair of that inquiry with full powers under the Tribunals and Inquiries Act of 1921, the act which should never have been replaced by the current act because there was nothing wrong with it, to complete my answer to your question. My brief in Shipman was to examine the systems of control and monitoring which had apparently failed so as to allow Shipman to get away with murdering many of his patients. I chose to sit alone rather than with a panel, and that's something I'll come back to from time to time. My terms of reference seemed to me to be a complete dog's breakfast. I really hardly understood them, but I was allowed to recast them, and I contrived to leave open the option of whether I made a full investigation of the extent of Shipman's criminal activity. The government had not asked me to do that. They wanted to know how to improve the systems. Mr. Alan Milburn was Secretary of State for Health at the time, and he wanted me to do it quickly. Governments always do. But I had a gut feeling that I was going to have to look at all the suspicious deaths. And once I'd arrived in Manchester, I soon became convinced that the absolute priority for the people of Hyde was who had Shipman killed. So I decided to embark upon a major factual investigation. This decision roughly doubled the length of the inquiry from about 2 years to 4, and probably doubled the cost. The investigation was very labour intensive, but I think it was the right thing to do. Indeed, I'm sure it was. I think it would have been dreadful to have a public inquiry into all the systems lasting, say, 2 years, and yet to leave the families with their questions unanswered. So we took on a huge number of part-time solicitors and paralegals and investigated the circumstances of the death of every one of Shipman's patients who had died while a patient of Shipman, and that was over a period of about 24 years. Of the 1,000 files that we opened, we were able to close about half without a full investigation, because it soon became apparent that Shipman couldn't possibly have had anything to do with the death. Say it had taken place abroad or in hospital, or had been a road traffic accident or something like that. But we did examine about 500 cases in depth, and I wrote an individual report, or little mini judgment really, explaining the circumstances of each death, the medical history, Shipman's actions and involvements, and reaching a conclusion as to whether or not he had been involved in causing the death. I identified 218 deaths where I was satisfied that he had killed the patient. There were about, as well as that, about 60 odd where I was deeply suspicious about what he'd been up to, but the evidence wasn't sufficiently convincing for me to make a positive conclusion.